My mother once told me, "Your sister gets everything from your father." She said this the day he died, while I was still changing his sheets and counting the pills left in his medicine bottles. I walked away in silence and left everything for them to discover. The truth is never gentle. My name is Margaret Ellison, and I'm 42 years old. I work as a records manager for a small law firm called Davenport and Myers, tucked away in the quiet suburb of Cedar Hollow. Most people would describe me as reserved, the kind of woman who keeps her house spotless, reads classic novels by the window, and knits scarves for charity drives. I don't attend the neighborhood barbecues or office happy hours. I prefer the company of books to people and silence to small talk. My family was different. They thrived on noise, on drama, on being seen. My mother, Janice Ellison, is 67 and has never met a social gathering she didn't want to dominate. She collects compliments like some people collect stamps, and she's always believed that her worth comes from how others perceive her. Even now, with her silver hair perfectly styled and her wardrobe full of clothes she can't quite afford, she carries herself like royalty visiting commoners. My sister Fiona is 38, 4 years younger than me, and she's everything my mother wanted in a daughter. Beautiful in that effortless way that makes people turn their heads on the street. Her honey-colored hair catches light like spun gold. And she has this laugh that sounds like champagne bubbles. She's changed jobs more times than I can count, drifting from boutique sales associate to yoga instructor to event planner to freelance photographer. But somehow she always lands on her feet. Or rather, she always lands in my mother's arms, ready to catch her. Then there was my father, Thomas Ellison. He died at 70, after 45 years of fixing industrial machinery at the plant downtown. Dad was the kind of man who spoke in actions rather than words. He had weathered hands that could repair anything, and eyes that saw everything but judged nothing. While my mother held court in the living room, Dad would retreat to his workshop in the garage, where he'd hum old songs and build birdhouses for neighbors who never asked for them. Growing up, I learned early that love in our house was distributed unequally. My mother made no secret of her favoritism. Fiona got the pretty dresses, the ballet lessons, the bedroom with the window seat. I got the chores, the responsibilities, and the expectation that I would handle whatever needed handling. When Fiona wanted to quit piano lessons after 2 weeks, Mom said, "Of course, darling. You shouldn't be forced to do something that doesn't inspire you." When I asked to take art classes at the community center, Mom said, "We can't afford luxuries right now. Margaret, be practical." I started working at 17, stocking shelves at the grocery store after school. Fiona was given an allowance that was twice what I earned in a week. When I asked why, Mom said, "You're so capable, dear. You don't need help like your sister does." But Dad saw. He always saw. He'd slip me $20 with a note that said, "For the art supplies." He'd bring home library books about painting techniques and leave them on my desk. When I saved enough money to buy my first car, a used Honda with a dented door, Dad spent his weekend fixing the engine and repainting the scratched bumper. "You're stronger than you know," he'd tell me, usually while we worked side by side in the garden. But don't let being strong mean you have to carry everyone else's weight. I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought being strong meant exactly that. When Dad retired at 65, something shifted in our family's delicate ecosystem. For the first time in decades, he was home all day. He planted tomatoes and built a small reading nook in the backyard. He'd sit there with his coffee in the mornings, watching the birds he'd been feeding for years. Mom wasn't pleased. She'd spent 40 years having the house to herself during the day, and now she felt cramped. "He's always underfoot," she'd complain to her friends during their bridge games. "I can't even have a phone conversation without him hovering." It wasn't hovering. Dad was just present, maybe for the first time in their marriage. Fiona was 28 then, and she'd just quit another job. This time it was a position at a marketing firm that she claimed was stifling her creativity. She'd started showing up at the house more often, usually around dinner time, with stories about her latest struggle and her hand out for what she called temporary support. Mom never said no. She'd slip Fiona hundreds of dollars and tell her not to worry about paying it back. "Family takes care of family," she'd say, as if I hadn't been taking care of myself since I was a teenager. Dad watched these exchanges with quiet disapproval, but he rarely intervened. He'd learned, over the years, that arguing with Mom about Fiona was like trying to reason with a hurricane. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in October. Dad was working in the garden, raking leaves, when he slipped on the wet grass and fell hard. The sound of his body hitting the ground was something I'll never forget, a dull thud that seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. He'd broken his hip. The doctors said it was a clean break, that he'd heal fine with proper care and physical therapy. But at 70, healing takes time, and Dad was never good at sitting still. Mom hired a part-time nurse, but she made it clear that she found the entire situation inconvenient. "I can't be expected to play nursemaid," she said. "I have commitments." Those commitments included her weekly bridge games, her book club, and her volunteer work at the hospital gift shop. None of them, apparently, could be postponed or canceled. So I stepped in. I reduced my hours at the law firm and started spending my evenings at my parents' house. I'd help Dad with his exercises, make sure he took his medications on time, and keep him company during the long afternoons when Mom was out with her friends. It was during those quiet hours that I began to notice things. Dad would get mail from the bank, and it would disappear before I could see what it was. When I asked him about it, he'd just shrug and say, "Your mother handles the finances." But I'd seen the worry in his eyes, the way he'd stare at the ceiling at night, or how he'd suddenly stop talking when Mom came into the room. One evening, while I was helping him to bed, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "If something happens to me, if you need to know the truth about anything, look in the third drawer of my desk, the one in the workshop." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he was already closing his eyes, and I didn't want to disturb his rest. The months that followed were a slow decline. Dad's hip healed, but something else was broken. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished. He'd sit in his chair by the window and watch the birds, but the light in his eyes was fading. Mom grew more impatient. She'd make comments about how Dad was letting himself go and how she was too young to be tied down by an invalid. She started taking weekend trips with her friends, leaving Dad alone except for the few hours I could manage to visit. Fiona was dealing with her own crisis. She'd started dating a man named Derek who owned a small construction company, and she was convinced he was going to propose. She'd show up at family dinners with expensive jewelry and new clothes, talking about their plans to travel to Europe and maybe start a business together. "Where does she get the money for all this?" I asked Mom one evening, watching Fiona model a designer handbag that cost more than I made in a month. "She's been doing well with her photography," Mom said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Dad said nothing, but I saw the way his jaw tightened. The end came on a Thursday morning in March. I'd stopped by the house before work to check on Dad, and I found him in his chair, staring out at the garden with a strange expression on his face. "The crocuses are coming up," he said, as if this was the most important thing in the world. I sat with him for a while, both of us watching the small purple flowers pushing through the last of the snow. He seemed peaceful, more at rest than he'd been in months. "I'm proud of you," he said suddenly. "I know I don't say it enough, but you've become exactly who I hoped you'd be." I squeezed his hand. "I love you, Dad." He smiled. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you know." I left for work feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Maybe Dad was finally starting to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. Maybe things would get better. The call came at 2 in the afternoon. Dad had collapsed in the garden. The paramedics said he'd died instantly, probably a heart attack. By the time I got to the house, his body was already being taken away. Mom was there, but she seemed more concerned with how she looked than with what had happened. She kept checking her makeup in the hallway mirror and adjusting her hair. "Where's Fiona?" I asked. "She's in Miami with Derek." Mom said, "Some business trip. I've left messages." I spent the rest of the day making phone calls, arranging for the funeral home, contacting Dad's coworkers and friends. Mom sat in the living room with a box of tissues, accepting condolences from neighbors and acting like she was the only one who'd lost anything. Fiona didn't make it back until the day before the funeral. She arrived with a tan and a new haircut, full of apologies and explanations about flight delays and work obligations. She hugged Mom and cried dramatically. But I noticed she was already planning her outfit for the service. The funeral was everything Dad would have hated. Mom insisted on an open casket, flowers everywhere, and a reception at the country club. I'd wanted something simple, a small service at the church where Dad had been a member for 30 years. But Mom said we needed to honor his memory properly. She meant we needed to put on a show. I handled the logistics because no one else would. I wrote the obituary, chose the flowers, and arranged for the pastor to speak. I picked out Dad's burial clothes and made sure his wedding ring was polished. Fiona showed up to the service in a black dress that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments. She took selfies by the casket and posted them on social media with captions about how much she missed her, Daddy. I stood in the back of the church during the service, watching a room full of people who barely knew my father talk about what a wonderful man he was. Mom sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and accepting hugs from friends who whispered about how strong she was being. After the burial, after the reception, after the last guest had gone home, Mom and I sat in the kitchen of the house where I'd grown up. Fiona was upstairs, resting, after her exhausting day of being consoled. We need to talk about practical matters, Mom said, pulling out a manila folder. I've been to see the lawyer. She spread papers across the kitchen table. Dad's will, bank statements, insurance policies. Your father left everything to me, of course, she said. But I think it's only fair that Fiona gets the house when I'm gone. She'll need the security more than you will. I looked at the papers without really reading them. Numbers and legal language that didn't seem to have anything to do with the man who'd raised me. The life insurance will cover the funeral and pay off the mortgage, Mom continued. And there's a small savings account, but nothing substantial. Your father was never good with money. That wasn't true. Dad had been careful with money, sometimes painfully so. He'd pack lunches for work instead of buying them, drive cars until they literally couldn't run anymore, and shop for clothes at discount stores. But I didn't argue. I just need you to sign here, Mom said, sliding a paper across the table. A waiver of any claim to the estate. It's just a formality, since you're doing so well on your own. I stared at the document. It was dense with legal language, but the gist was clear. I was giving up any right to inherit anything from my father. Fiona doesn't have a career like you do, Mom continued. She'll need help getting on her feet. And I'm not getting any younger. I need to know she'll be taken care of. I thought about all the times I'd taken care of myself, all the times I'd worked extra hours to pay for things my parents couldn't afford, all the times I'd come home to help with Dad while Mom was out enjoying her freedom. I thought about Fiona's designer handbags and her trips to Miami, about her constant need for temporary support that was never repaid. I thought about Dad, sitting in his chair by the window, watching the birds he'd fed for years. I signed the paper. Mom looked relieved. I knew you'd understand. You've always been the practical one. I left that night without saying goodbye to Fiona. I drove home to my small apartment, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on my couch trying to process what had just happened. The next morning, I remembered Dad's words about the third drawer. I drove back to the house while Mom was at her grief counseling session and Fiona was still in bed. I went straight to Dad's workshop, a space that had always felt like a sanctuary to me. His desk was an old wooden piece he'd built himself, with 3 drawers on the right side. The third drawer stuck a little when I pulled it, the way it always had, inside. I found a manila envelope with my name written on it in Dad's careful handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it. There were several documents inside. The first was a lease agreement for a small apartment across town, a place I'd never seen before. The lease was paid up for a full year, and it was in my name. The second document was a savings account statement. The account was also in my name, and it contained more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Not a fortune, but enough to live comfortably for several years. The third document was a letter, written in Dad's neat script. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I hope you've learned what I tried to teach you while I was here. You don't have to carry everyone else's weight. You don't have to be strong for people who refuse to be strong for themselves. I've been moving money out of the joint account for the past 5 years, a little at a time. Your mother and sister never paid attention to the finances, so they never noticed. They think the account contains everything I saved over 45 years of work. They're wrong. This money is for you because you're the one who deserves it. You're the one who worked for everything you have. You're the one who took care of me when I needed it most. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for accepting what I'm giving you. You've earned it 1,000 times over. The apartment is small, but it's in a quiet neighborhood near the lake. I thought you might like the piece. I've been paying the rent for 6 months, telling the landlord it was for a friend's daughter who was moving to town. Live your life, Margaret. Don't live anyone else's. All my love, Dad." I sat in that dusty workshop for an hour, reading and rereading the letter. Dad had known. He'd known exactly what would happen after he died, and he'd made sure I wouldn't be left with nothing. I thought about the waiver I'd signed, giving up my claim to an estate that was already mostly empty. I thought about Mom's relief when I'd signed it, and Fiona's assumption that she'd inherit everything. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to be good enough, trying to earn the love that was freely given to my sister. I packed up the documents and drove to the apartment Dad had rented for me. It was exactly as he'd described: small, quiet, and beautiful. The windows looked out over a lake where swans glided across the water like white dreams. I moved in that weekend. I didn't tell Mom or Fiona where I was going. I just packed my things and left. It was 3 weeks before they realized I was gone. Mom called my old apartment and got a message saying the number was disconnected. She tried my work, but I'd taken a leave of absence to deal with my grief. When they finally tracked me down, Mom was frantic. "Margaret, what are you doing? Why didn't you tell us you were moving?" I was sitting on the small dock behind my new apartment, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. "I needed some space," I said. "But we need you," Mom said. "There are things to sort out, decisions to make." I could hear the panic in her voice, but I felt nothing but calm. "You'll figure it out," I said. I stopped answering their calls after that. I changed my phone number and asked the post office to forward my mail to the apartment. I started shopping at different stores, taking different routes to work. I wanted to disappear from their lives as completely as they'd made me disappear from my own. It was Eric Moore who helped me understand what I was doing. Eric worked at Davenport and Myers in the estate planning department. He was a quiet man, about my age, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He'd been the one to handle the legal paperwork after Dad's death. And he'd been nothing but professional and compassionate. We'd started having lunch together, just as colleagues, but it had gradually become something more. He was the first person I'd told about the apartment, about Dad's letter, about my decision to walk away. "You're not abandoning them," he said over coffee one afternoon. "You're finally taking care of yourself." "It feels like abandoning them," I admitted. "Sometimes." Eric said, "The people we love have to learn to swim on their own. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." It was Eric who was with me when the phone calls started coming in earnest. Mom's friends, neighbors, even some of Dad's old co-workers. They all had the same message. Mom and Fiona were in trouble. The story came out in pieces. Fiona's boyfriend Derek had disappeared, taking with him the money she'd invested in his business. Money that, it turned out, had come from Dad's account. Mom had been supplementing Fiona's lifestyle for years, paying for trips and clothes and cars with money she'd thought would last forever. The savings account they'd inherited was empty within 6 months. The house was mortgaged to the hilt. Mom's credit cards were maxed out. Fiona was living in the basement, unable to afford rent anywhere else. "They're asking about you," Eric said gently. "People are wondering where you are." I knew what that meant. In a small town like Cedar Hollow, People talked. The story of the grieving daughter who disappeared was probably more interesting than the story of the family who'd spent their inheritance on designer handbags and trips to Miami. Part of me felt sorry for them, but a larger part of me felt free. I'd spent 42 years being the responsible one, the one who cleaned up the messes and paid the bills and asked for nothing in return. I'd spent 42 years being invisible while my sister was celebrated for doing the bare minimum. Now they were learning what it felt like to be responsible for themselves. I bought a small easel and started painting again, something I hadn't done since high school. I painted the lake at different times of day, in different seasons. I painted the birds that came to the feeder I'd hung outside my window. I painted portraits of Dad from memory, trying to capture the kindness in his eyes. I joined a book club at the library and made friends with women who knew nothing about my family drama. I learned to cook for one person, to enjoy quiet evenings without feeling guilty about not being somewhere else. I started dating Eric officially. He was everything my family wasn't: stable, kind, and content with a simple life. He didn't need me to save him or support him or make excuses for him. He just enjoyed my company, and I enjoyed his. 6 months after I moved to the apartment, Fiona showed up at my door. She looked different, thinner, older, with dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater that looked like they'd seen better days. "Can I come in?" she asked. I almost said no, but something in her expression stopped me. For the first time in our adult lives, she looked vulnerable without being manipulative. We sat at my small kitchen table, and she told me everything about Derek, about the money, about the promises he'd made that turned out to be lies, about Mom's mounting debts and the second mortgage on the house, about the collectors who called every day. "I know you probably think I deserve this," she said, "and maybe I do. But Mom, she's not handling it well. She's been drinking, and she's not taking care of herself." I listened without comment. I'd heard this story before, in different forms. Fiona in crisis, Mom struggling, and me expected to fix everything. "I'm not asking you to come back," Fiona continued. "I know we hurt you. I know we took advantage of you. But I need to know. Do you have any idea where Dad might have put money? Something we missed?" I looked at my sister, this woman who'd shared my childhood but lived in a completely different world. She was asking me to help her, after 42 years of taking my help for granted. "No," I said. "I don't know anything about hidden money." It wasn't technically a lie. The money Dad had left me wasn't hidden. It was exactly where he'd intended it to be. Fiona nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "I should go," she said. "But Margaret..." "I'm sorry. For everything. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I needed to say it." She left, and I watched her walk down the street to her old car. For a moment, I almost called her back. Almost offered to help, to loan her money, to be the sister I'd always been. But then I remembered Dad's letter. "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for accepting what I'm giving you." I closed the door and went back to my painting. Winter came early that year. The lake froze, and I watched ice fishermen set up their small shelters on the white expanse. I painted them too. Small figures against the vast emptiness, each one alone, but somehow purposeful. I heard through the town grapevine that Mom and Fiona had moved into a small apartment downtown. Mom had taken a job at the department store, her first job in 30 years. Fiona was working at a call center and taking community college classes at night. I felt a strange kind of pride when I heard that. Not pride in their circumstances, but pride in their decision to finally take responsibility for themselves. Spring came, and I sat on my dock watching the ice break up on the lake. It was violent and beautiful. The way change always is. Great sheets of ice cracking and shifting, making room for the water to flow freely again. I thought about Dad, about the way he'd sat in his chair watching the crocuses push through the snow. He'd known that spring was coming, even when everything looked dead and frozen. I thought about the seeds he'd planted in my life, the quiet ways he'd shown me that I was worthy of love, worthy of care, worthy of my own life. I thought about the last thing he'd said to me. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you know. He'd been right. I was stronger than I'd known. But I'd finally learned that being strong didn't mean carrying everyone else's weight. Eric proposed to me on a Sunday morning in May. We were sitting on the dock, drinking coffee and watching the swans glide across the water. It wasn't a dramatic proposal, just a quiet question asked between two people who'd learned to love without drama. I said yes. We had a small wedding in the garden behind the apartment building. Mom and Fiona weren't invited, not out of spite, but because I wanted to start this new chapter of my life surrounded by people who'd chosen to be there, not people who felt obligated. The officiant was the librarian from my book club. The guests were friends from work, neighbors from the apartment complex, and Eric's family, who'd welcomed me with the kind of warmth I'd never experienced before. I wore a simple dress I'd bought at a shop downtown, and I carried wildflowers Eric had picked from the meadow behind the lake. There were no photographers, no elaborate decorations, no drama. It was perfect. A year later, I was cleaning out Dad's workshop. Mom had finally lost the house, and the new owners wanted it emptied. I volunteered to take care of Dad's tools and personal items, partly because I didn't trust anyone else to do it with care. I found another letter, tucked behind his workbench. This one was addressed to my daughter's future family. To whoever is reading this, it began. I hope you're someone who sees Margaret the way I do. She spent her life taking care of others, sometimes at the expense of taking care of herself. She's strong and capable and kind, but she's also human. She needs someone who will take care of her the way she's taken care of everyone else. If you're lucky enough to be part of her life, remember that she's been disappointed by family before. She might not believe, at first, that you're different. Be patient with her. She's worth the wait. And if you're reading this because you're her husband, then you've already figured out what I knew from the day she was born. Margaret is the best of us. Love her like she deserves to be loved. With gratitude for loving my daughter. Thomas Ellison, I sat in that empty workshop and cried for the first time since Dad's funeral. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief. The knowledge that I'd been seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. I showed the letter to Eric that night. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and handed it back to me. He was right, Eric said. You are worth the wait. I keep both of Dad's letters in the drawer of my bedside table. Sometimes, when I'm feeling uncertain about the choices I've made, I take them out and read them again. They remind me that walking away isn't always abandonment. Sometimes it's the only way to save yourself. They remind me that love isn't about sacrifice. It's about choice. They remind me that the people who truly love you want you to be happy, even if your happiness doesn't include them. It's been 3 years since I moved to the apartment by the lake. Eric and I live there together now, in a life that's quiet and simple and entirely our own. We don't have drama or crisis or constant emergencies. We have books and coffee and long conversations about nothing important. We have peace. I still see Mom and Fiona occasionally, at the grocery store or the post office. We nod politely, exchange pleasantries about the weather. Mom looks older, but also somehow lighter. Fiona has a steadiness about her now that she never had before. They're both working, both supporting themselves. They've learned to swim on their own, just like Eric said they would. I don't feel guilty anymore about the money Dad left me. I don't feel guilty about the apartment, or the wedding they weren't invited to, or the life I've built without them. I feel grateful. Grateful for a father who saw me when I felt invisible. Grateful for a husband who loves me without needing me to be anything other than myself. Grateful for the courage to choose my own happiness over everyone else's expectations. This morning, I was sitting on the dock watching the sunrise when I heard the familiar sound of geese flying south. They moved across the sky in their perfect V formation, each bird following the one ahead, each bird taking its turn at the front. I thought about how they trust each other to take the lead when it's their turn, how they don't carry the birds who can't keep up, how they know, instinctively, that the strength of the flock depends on each bird taking responsibility for itself. I thought about Dad, about the way he'd trusted me to find my own way, about the way he'd given me the tools I needed and then let me choose how to use them. I thought about the last conversation we'd had, about the crocuses pushing through the snow, about the way he'd smiled when he told me he was proud of me. I thought about the truth that took me 42 years to understand. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to let them go. Mom was wrong when she said Fiona got everything from Dad. Fiona got money. And money runs out. Fiona got favoritism. And favoritism is hollow. I got something different. I got the quiet lessons, the patient guidance, the steady presence that taught me who I was capable of becoming. I got the knowledge that I was worthy of love, worthy of care, worthy of my own life. They said my sister got everything from our father. They didn't know that the only thing he left behind was me.